You've probably seen it online, in articles, in really heated debates. There's this deep friction happening within the Black community. On one side, you have the Foundational Black Americans Movement, or FBA, and on the other, a group of really prominent Black intellectuals. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into the source of that conflict and, well, the answer is a lot more philosophical than you might think.
So let's just get right to the heart of it. What is going on here? Why does this clash seem so consistent, so predictable? It's a question that sparks endless arguments, so let's try to understand why this conflict is just so persistent.
The analysis we're digging into here suggests the answer isn't about personal beefs or someone selling out. It's way deeper than that. It's a fundamental clash of worldviews. We're talking about two completely different ways of understanding power, responsibility, and the actual path to progress.
To really get a handle on this clash, we have to start by breaking down the FBA framework. This side of the argument is built on a really specific and powerful premise about history and justice.
Okay, first things first, the definition here is absolutely key. FBA is not just a blanket term for every Black person in America. Not at all. It specifically, and politically, refers to people who can trace their lineage back to the system of chattel slavery right here in the U.S. That distinction isn't just a detail, it's the absolute bedrock of the entire FBA political identity.
So this identity is really built on three core pillars. Number one, lineage matters most. That specific historical line is the most important political factor. Number two, injustice explains outcomes. The idea here is that the historical injustice done to this group is the main reason for the disparities we see today. And number three, justice requires redress. This means that real justice can only happen through group-specific action, with a major focus on reparations. The whole framework is designed for political leverage.
All right, now let's flip the coin and look at the other side. The intellectuals who are often at odds with the FBA movement aren't necessarily disagreeing with the history. What they're doing is starting from a completely different question.
They're asking a fundamentally different question. So while the FBA framework is asking what is owed, these thinkers are asking what actually works, what produces real progress and uplifts communities today. It might sound like a small shift in language, but it changes absolutely everything.
Because once you start asking what works, you kind of open up a whole can of worms. You have to start looking at all these complex and, let's be honest, sometimes uncomfortable variables. You start analyzing things like economic incentives, cultural behaviors, how effective our institutions are, and the idea of trade-offs. And digging into all that, it automatically complicates a political story that really depends on the moral clarity of historical grievance.
Now, this isn't just some abstract theory. Let's make it real. Let's look at three specific thinkers whose work puts them right in the crosshairs of this collision between worldviews.
And this right here, this boils the entire conflict down to its absolute essence. You've got two fundamentally different questions. One is moral and historical. It's demanding justice for a past debt. The other is pragmatic and analytical. It's searching for an instruction manual for what causes progress right now. They're aiming at totally different targets, and that's exactly where the friction sparks.
Okay, our first case study is the economist Thomas Sowell. And if you followed these debates at all, you know his name is basically a lightning rod for this exact conflict.
So Sowell doesn't deny that racism exists. That's a common misreading. Instead, his argument, as laid out in the source, is that racism isn't the primary factor explaining the outcomes we see today. He points to things like family structure, the quality of schools, and, a big one for him, the success of Black immigrants from places like the Caribbean and Africa, to argue that culture and policy incentives are actually more powerful tools for explaining what's happening.
And here is exactly why that argument is so explosive. It breaks that clean, straight line, that narrative that's so foundational to the FBA political claim. The one that goes slavery leads to racism, which leads to present-day failure. If other factors besides historical injustice can lead to success, well, the moral clarity needed for a reparations-focused movement starts to get a little fuzzy. It introduces complexity where the movement needs a simple, powerful truth.
Next up, we have economist Glenn Loury. Now, his work brings a different kind of tension to the table. This one isn't so much about external factors, it's about internal critique and accountability.
And this really gets to the heart of it. Loury argues for the importance of looking inward, of discussing social pathologies and moral accountability within the community itself. But for a political movement to work, it often needs narrative unity, everyone on the same page, to build leverage. So, from the perspective of a movement, publicly talking about these internal issues can feel like sabotage. But for an intellectual, asking those hard questions is the entire job.
Our final example is the linguist and writer John McWhorter, who kind of reframes the whole conflict by taking a step back and looking at the very structure of the ideology itself.
McWhorter's big idea is that some forms of modern anti-racism, and he would include FBA ideology here, operate a lot like a religion. There are sacred beliefs, like the absolute centrality of historical grievance, and then there are heresies, or forbidden questions. And the implication of that is pretty profound. It means when someone like a Sowell or a Lowry raises a tough question, it's not just seen as a disagreement you can debate. It's seen as an attack on the faith itself.
So if we zoom out from these individual examples, we can start to see they're not just isolated incidents. They all point to this consistent underlying pattern, a fundamental mismatch in what each side is actually trying to do. This table lays it out perfectly. The FBA ideology prioritizes political leverage, which works best when you have moral clarity and you focus on external responsibility. The intellectuals, on the other hand, prioritize explanatory accuracy. That means they have to wrestle with nuance and focus on what drives institutional outcomes, even when the answers get really complicated.
Okay, here's a perfect example of how this communication completely breaks down. An intellectual who's aiming for explanatory accuracy might say, hey, the success of certain immigrant groups complicates a simple racism-based narrative because they're trying to analyze all the different variables that lead to success.
But someone operating inside the FBA framework who is focused on political leverage rooted in that specific history hears something completely different. They hear a dismissal of their entire foundational claim. They hear, your history doesn't matter. They're not even having the same conversation because, as the source material puts it, they're fighting two totally different battles.
So, at the end of the day, this isn't really a story of good guys and bad guys. The source we're looking at defines this perfectly as a role conflict. Each side is performing a different and ultimately incompatible job.
And this slide right here captures that core problem perfectly. The role of a political movement is to create, simplify, and enforce a narrative to get something done. The role of an intellectual, though, is to complicate, question, and test those narratives in a search for what's true. By their very nature, those two jobs are always going to be in opposition.
So we end right where we began, but hopefully with a much clearer answer. This clash isn't really personal, it's structural. One side is asking what is owed, the other is asking what works. And those two questions lead down two completely different paths, creating two different battles. And until that fundamental incompatibility is understood, this friction of truth, well, it's pretty much destined to continue.